They believe those who were impacted by the transatlantic slave trade and brought over to America are the lost tribes of Israel, and that God is using them to awaken up black people and other ethnicities that they have, typically aligned in the 12 tribes of Israel, to know their true identity.
Preach!
First and foremost, this is
it.
important for us to think about scriptures, listen to me, of the ethnic composition of Israel.
Okay.
We know that in the Bible, there were several times when Israel engrafted other people. And this is helpful for us to understand that from the beginning, God has had a heart for all nations, tribes, and tongues. And in fact, Psalm 67 tells us that the Israelites are to be a light to the nations that they may know the glory of God. When we read Revelations, we understand that it will be all tribes, nations, and tongues that believe in Jesus Christ. Zechariah 2 verse 11 tells us, and many nations shall be joined to the Lord in that day, and shall be my people, and I will dwell in the midst of thee.
But stop, brother preacher. If you're going to do Revelation, let's do it right. Because Revelation chapter 7, it specifically talks about the 12 tribes of Israel. Hurt not the earth, neither the sea, nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our Elohim in their foreheads. And I heard the number of them which were sealed. There were sealed 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel. So, brother preacher, the Messiah said in Matthew's 24, he said, immediately after the tribulation of those days, okay, that he would send the angels to the four corners to gather the elect. So that's what the Messiah said. And his disciple, Yachanan, said it, that he had to seal the 144,000 of the tribes of Israel. So, to your point, yes, all other nations are going to come, but there is a specific nation called the nation of Israel that is leading this futuristic apocalyptic event called what? The ingathering. You probably believe in the rapture. Everybody's going up to heaven. But the scripture doesn't talk about people going back to heaven. It's talking about gathering the elect from the four corners. That's why one of the feasts is a foreshadow of that, which is the year-end feast called the Feast of Tabernacles, which in the Hebrew tongue is called Sukkah.
Fourth thing we need to understand is, do you know God's redemptive plan?
So he keeps repeating, reading these books.
To save all people and nations. Now,
we're not
I want to be clear that even as we go through these points, different camps believe.
We're not debating whether or not all nations. Now, you got them ABC camps that believe that nonsense, and they got a mass of people following with that nonsense. But that's not what the book says. The book says the Abrahamic covenant was a covenant that he would be a father of many nations. He didn't discriminate or isolate him from the other sons of Adam that were not physical descendants of the nation of Israel. So to discredit them and to not include them is showing that you have a lack of knowledge of the scriptures.
fifth point I want us to consider before we engage those of Hebrew Israelism is this. Are you competent to have a discussion about the Hebrew language? In your dialogue with this cult, many topics or even rabbit trails will eventually touch on the meaning of a word in Hebrew. Having a firm grasp on the biblical languages could work in your favor as you try to defend the faith.
So I take it not offensive of him saying, cult. I mean, I guess it's making him feel good to call the Hebrew Israelite a cult. But apparently he doesn't know what a cult is. There is a difference between a cult and an occult. A cult is just a group of people that have similar beliefs. Okay. The Christian church is a cult. Jehovah's Witness is a cult. Islam is a cult, right? Buddhism is a cult, right? Lesbianism is a cult, right? Heterosexualism is a cult, right? It's a group of people that have similar beliefs and they kind of group together because they believe the same way. Ethnicity is a cult, right? That's where you get the word culture from, right? Cult means to gather together, right? So, him using the word cult is not an insult. So I won't be insulted by that. His anger and frustration is evident because he keeps using that phraseology. But let's get to the meat of it, all right?
6 points that we need to study before we engage with Black Hebrew Israelites or those of Hebrew Israelism is, are you competent to have a discussion about...
Now, notice he's not quoting anybody of any... like historical figures. All of the writers he's quoting is people that, and I can probably guarantee you that the majority of these writers in some form, fashion, or shape came through that Dallas Theological Seminary.
Racism and racial reconciliation. Do you know that most people in Black religious cults are dealing with the problem of evil, and therefore that many of those religious leaders construct a mythology to deal with the loss of identity and dignity in the Black experience? And so for us as Christians, we have to have...
Well, you may have some people that may have been their motivation. I'm not one. My experience didn't come through me hearing somebody and them, tell me I'm an Israelite. Mine was personal. The Most High revealed it to me that I was an Israelite while I was pastoring, and I was a street preacher in the streets ministering, just like many preachers do today. So that only holds weight in some circles because you do have, I will say to his point, you do have some Black people that have a lack of identity, and when they came in contact with the Hebraic movement that expressed that we are the children of Israel, the only thing that they really, really, really fully, really embraced is the identity and the culture. And I say this much: the identity and the culture does not guarantee you entrance into the kingdom. For the nation of Israel knew they were Israelites. They had the culture, but they broke the covenant. So it's not so much that the intelligent or the intellectual Hebrews that study the book and read it see that there's a lot of holes. There have been a lot of holes in Christian theology. For example, one of the biggest theological beliefs that has a hole in it is people dying and going to heaven. It's not in the book. Nowhere. People dying and going to heaven. One place, Shaul says, be absent from the body, present with the Lord. So that means you go to heaven when you die. So all of the so-called scholars that, and many of them went to Dallas Theological Seminary, teach that when people die, they go to heaven. So they at the funeral talking about my loved one is up in heaven looking down and smiling. You have a very few that might not teach that, but the majority of them do teach that. That's a primary teaching that is, it has a whole. So when you ask a person to prove that in the scriptures, they can't prove it. Here's another one that kind of makes people, it has nothing to do with identity. This is how I came. When I would read in the Bible, remember the seventh day, and we were keeping the first day, and I'm reading it in the book, remember the seventh day. I couldn't find nowhere in that book where it said remember the first day. So when I went to the people that I had respect for that were Bible scholars and theologians and my teachers and asked the question, you know what they told me? The church changed the Sabbath. Just like you said, the church changed the scriptures, the books that was written. The church decided which books was good and which wasn't good. So everybody don't have that testimony of, they're looking for, or they didn't have an identity. Some that you may have some validity in some circles, but generally that's not true. So if you come at me with identity, or anybody that has any knowledge of the scriptures, they're going to eat you alive with that.
Have a true understanding of the racial sin in America.
And furthermore, let me add to that. If you say that they don't have, that they have an identity crisis, please explain to me Genesis 10, where it says that after the flood, all the sons of the earth was overspread. Which one of the sons do the African Americans come from? And how can we identify the African Americans today? By lineage, by lineage. Okay. Dallas Theological Seminary used to say that blacks came from Canaan and they were cursed to be slaves. It's a partial truth in that, but it's not complete, because Israel and Canaan married. You can read that in Judges chapter 3. Okay. So maybe they had something, but they just never really knew how to explain it. That it was the people that married into the Canaanite family that went into captivity, because judgment was pronounced on Canaan and the Israelites' blessing was pronounced on Israel. And the Most High told Israel that if you obey me, you'll keep the curses off of you. But if you disobey me, the curse is going to come on you. So how did the curses come on Israel? Because Israel had the bloodline of the cursed seed, the Canaanites, in the mix of their family union. The very first son, Yehuda, he married a Canaanite. Through the Canaanite line, you have the Messiah. So let's not go there with the identity thing, Pastor. Let's continue.
How the Bible applies principles for us to deal with those particular predicaments. John chapter 10, verse 16 tells us, and other sheep I have, which are not of this fold. Them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one fold and one shepherd. Here, Jesus is telling the apostles that they will go out, and there will be other sheep that are not of this fold, and they will believe, and they will be of one shepherd, and essentially one fold. I highly recommend this.
Okay, so to his point there,
one of my personal oneness embrace.
I don't disagree with that. I mean, you're barking up the wrong tree with that. Okay. True Hebrews.
Point number 7 is this.
True Hebrews recognize that other people of other nations can be a part of the Abrahamic covenant. That is beyond the shadow of a doubt. Next point.